Hello and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole, as always, and today I'm taking a little bit of a break from my traversal of Bach's Inventions and Sinfonias to bring you a piece by a contemporary of Bach's, Domenico Scarlatti. Now, Scarlatti had a very different trajectory as a musician. He left his native Italy to work for the Portuguese princess as her music master, and he followed her when she became Queen of Spain to Madrid, where he lived for the rest of his life. And those influences from Portugal and from Spain are very clearly heard in his music. Scarlatti was not primarily a contrapuntal composer in the style of Bach. Instead, he went in for a kind of very colorful, virtuosic style at the keyboard, which happens to transfer quite well to the modern piano. Speaking about the question of instrument, of course, the harpsichord would have been the instrument that Scarlatti would have used the majority of the time. However, it's now become known that he did in fact have access to early pianos at the court of Maria Barbara. These by no means would have been instruments much like our modern day pianos, but they would have been capable of dynamic variation. And so many of these pieces, which seem to lend themselves quite well to a performance that has dynamic variation in it, may have been sonatas that he actually had a chance to play on pianos. So kind of an interesting little factoid and something that you can use to defend playing these pieces on the piano. If any purists are bothering you about playing them on the harpsichord, well, it turns out that Scarlatti actually had pianos available to him. This particular sonata comes from the only published collection of Scarlatti's keyboard music during his lifetime, the 30 esercizi, which were ostensibly written for Maria Barbara to play on the harpsichord. So Maria Barbara must have been a quite talented keyboard player to be able to manage the technical difficulties in these works. This particular one is vertiginous and virtuosic to the extreme, and it features a type of technical difficulty which was very much associated with Scarlatti specifically. This is rapid hand crossings. So it happens throughout the piece. So you see this kind of hand crossing in a lot of the early sonatas by Scarlatti. I should mention probably that Scarlatti does have 555 of these one-movement sonatas that he wrote. As I was mentioning, only these 30 were ever published, but the rest were written for, I guess, for Maria Barbara's performance. And toward the end, in the later sonatas, he stops really using this sort of hand crossing. Supposedly this was because the Queen did become a little bit heavier with time, and she could no longer comfortably kind of negotiate these sort of hand crossings in later life. So in this particular piece, I wanted to talk about something to do with performance practice, because as is normal for me, after I've learned a piece, I do like to go and just kind of take a survey of the recorded field and hear what people have done with the pieces that I'm playing. Although I tend to like to wait until I've mastered the piece myself so that I'm not unduly influenced by anyone else, it's very interesting to do that, and oftentimes I hear little things that influence my interpretation or which help me to make things sound a little bit better. I think it's always good to do that. So in this one, though, it was particularly interesting for me because most of the recordings that I heard were from very recent. There's quite a few live performances that you can hear from young pianists on YouTube playing this piece, and it became apparent to me very rapidly that almost all these interpretations were imitating one particular recording. That is a studio recording by Mikhail Pletnev from 1995. Pletnev made an album of Scarlatti sonatas, which I do highly recommend. It's a really great album, very, very interesting. As is usually the case with Pletnev, he does some very unusual things with the music. He really transforms the pieces into his own pieces almost. I mean, it almost sometimes sounds like it should be written Scarlatti arranged by Pletnev because of some of the changes that he makes. And this sonata is definitely an example of that. So I kind of wanted to mention some of these things because it does bring up the issue of how traditions start in performance and arguably how damaging those sort of traditions can be on later performances and how careful we have to be about not being stuck imitating traditions, no matter how interesting the originator for that tradition may be. So one of the things that you'll notice right away if you do go and listen to Pletnev's recording is you'll find he plays the opening repeated notes here. There's a kind of volley of repeated notes, almost sounds like castanets or something like that. He plays it very, very, very fast, much faster than his tempo for the rest of the movement, in fact. That's because this sort of technique where the repeated notes are split between your left and right hands is much easier to play than when you have repeated notes in one hand by itself. So this opening volley of repeated notes is going to be followed by a much trickier passage where you have repeated notes just on the right hand, and it's not really possible to play that quite as fast as the opening. So this in and of itself is not so much of a problem for me. It does, though, introduce a kind of super freedom to the tempo, which I think might be at odds with what Scarlatti might have had in mind. If we take this as being kind of like a flamenco-inspired dance piece, then maybe it's not appropriate to play the opening so incredibly rapid. However, we'll leave that aside for now because I don't think it's necessarily wrong to have a certain degree of flexibility in your tempo. So my real problems with Pletnev's interpretation only come a little bit later. So when he gets to that passage which I just quoted to you with the hand crossings. So here, Scarlatti has very clearly marked that these are supposed to be hand crossings. The G in the upper staff indicates the left hand, main gauche, as opposed to the right hand, which would be indicated by a D. And what Pletnev does here, a very interesting thing, he transposes the right hand part up an octave so that he can play these high notes, the notes that you cross over with the right hand instead of the left hand. And by doing this, he completely eliminates the acrobatic challenge of these passages, which I think is kind of the whole point. I'm always in favor, of course, of simplifications when it enables the musical point of a passage to come through more clearly. But in this case, simplifying in this way removes the drama from the passage, removes the kind of physical drama from the passage, and totally changes its sound as well. When you have to cross over with the left hand, you have to kind of almost poke those high notes out in order to get them fast enough, in order to get back to the low note. In Pletnev's interpretation, he's able to completely change this into more of kind of a dream-like passage, much more of a distant kind of sound at this point. And you don't really hear the high note as being separate from the chords. So for me, I think this is kind of unforgivable, although he comes up with an interesting interpretation of his own. This change also enables him to play way faster here once again. So this idea of kind of the unpredictability of the tempo is very strongly exploited by Pletnev. It's a little feels false to me because I think there's kind of a rhythmic backbone and a dance-like character to this sonata, which you lose if the tempo changes so much all the time. So this is followed by another kind of interesting change which Pletnev does in measure 25. You see here, Scarlatti has written something kind of interesting. He's written 32nd notes followed by a 16th note in this little pattern. And what Pletnev does is he slows the tempo down quite a bit here, and he plays triplets instead of this little rhythm. So it's a fairly subtle change, and to me, this actually makes sense in a way, because if you were actually playing this passage at the main tempo for the movement, you would find that the rhythm of a triplet and the rhythm of 2 32nds and a 16th is hardly different. You can hardly notice the difference if you're playing this at full tempo. And in fact, Scarlatti does use a kind of notation akin to this a few bars later. You see in these rapid scales, he puts 2 64th notes at the end of this first beat, and undoubtedly this is because he just wants to fit an extra note into these scales. It's not because he literally wants you to play the last 2 notes twice as fast as all the other notes. You won't even hear that difference at a really rapid tempo. So it's just his kind of shorthand. So it would seem that Scarlatti may have been influenced by the notational practices of the day, where you would tend to avoid writing triplets in a generally duple kind of texture. You can see this also in many of Bach's works and Handel's works and other composers from this time, that they tended to kind of avoid that kind of writing. So in this case, that kind of change makes sense. However, the fact that he's slowed down the tempo makes it a little bit more problematic for me, because then you can really hear that this is a very smooth rhythm instead of having a little bit more of a sharp, dramatic character to it. This change in particular becomes quite exaggerated in some of the interpretations that are, I think, probably imitating Pletnev. There was one artist who did something kind of interesting here and kind of horrifying at the same time. This one pianist slowed this passage down so much that it almost sounds like a adagio or a largo at this point, and played in triplets, so that this entire passage was completely transformed, like it comes from a different piece altogether, and we're now in a slow tempo. So very interesting and very convincingly interpreted. Again, kind of horrifying from the perspective of the meaning of the piece, though, and the intention of the composer, I suppose. I guess I'm one of those people who feel like we should not completely violate the intention of the composer in our search for creativity and self-expression. I think those things are very important to be creative and to express ourselves, but at the same time, we don't want to completely transform the work into something totally different. So we're kind of getting into philosophy here, but it is one example of how imitation can get a little bit out of hand, because this performer obviously just heard this idea from Pletnev's recording, decided to do it themselves, and decided to take it a bit further, and ended up with something which is a little bit of, not even a little bit, but very much a distortion of the original. So my 2 cents, you might happen to really love that version, in which case no shame, because it is very interesting what that performer does there. But it must be admitted, it is kind of changing the feel of the original a lot. So as an antidote to that, you might want to go and listen to Scott Ross's interpretation of this sonata, which is also very beautiful. Scott Ross, of course, was the very first performer to ever record all 555 Scarlatti sonatas. He did this on the harpsichord. He was primarily a harpsichordist. And that's a really wonderful traversal of the sonatas. But you will notice that in many of these presto sonatas, he plays quite a bit slower, and in more of a still very bright way, but a little bit more precise and controlled and dance-like kind of interpretation. So that brings me back to the whole tempo issue, which I'm going to close with before giving you my complete performance. So this sonata is marked presto, and in most of the interpretations, including Pletnev's and the ones that were inspired by him, you can hear quite a bit of variation of tempo. So most performers seem to try to play as fast as they can most of the time, and those opening repeated notes you can play very, very rapidly. You have to slow down later on, of course, in the lyrical part, in the places where you have a lot of repeated notes, in order to actually play them. So that was a little curious to me. I kind of wondered why, if Scarlatti meant for this opening, for instance, to be super, super fast, why did he write a sort of technique later which couldn't maintain that tempo? Is it that this whole indication of presto is being misunderstood by modern performers, or what's going on here? I think that there is some evidence, this piece maybe is one piece of evidence, that Scarlatti and other Italian-born composers might have meant something a little different by presto than what we generally understand it as today. I think that if you look at the works of Germanic composers, composers like Mozart or Haydn or Beethoven, or etc., they tended to use the word presto to indicate something that was as fast as possible, basically as fast as you could play. I think that's borne out by many examples in their works, as well as by things that they themselves said. Now, for Italians, though, maybe it was not the case, and we have a little bit of evidence for this if you look at one of Mozart's letters which he wrote after his infamous duel with Clementi. He said something to the effect that Clementi is a charlatan like all Italians. He will put presto and cut time over a first movement of a sonata, and then he'll play allegro 4/4. So what he was saying there was that his presto tempos were much slower than he was expecting. He was playing them like what Mozart would have written as an allegro and 4/4. So maybe this is just an example of a difference of nomenclature, that presto was not the fastest possible tempo for an Italian. Maybe they saved that for prestissimo, and presto was almost more like allegro would have been for someone like Mozart. If you think about the Italian word, I mean, presto literally means fast. And although allegro is generally taken as being a fast tempo, it really just means lively or cheerful or something like that. So it's not necessarily the case that it even indicates a super fast tempo. So that would suggest certain things about how you should play allegro movements as well for Italian-born composers, at least at that time. Maybe they really were intended to be on a little bit of a different scale compared to the more German-born composers. That's kind of an interesting thing. So I'm inclined to think that the whole issue is a little bit brought on by this. So someone like Pletnev sees presto, thinks as fast as possible, and wants to play as much of the piece as fast as possible, as fast as they possibly can, without really considering the cohesiveness of the tempo as a whole. So there you go. I don't know who's right in all this. I don't think there really is a right or a wrong. It's just kind of my own opinion about it. And so in my interpretation, I try to go a little bit more for this kind of dance-like thing. I still go for a fast tempo, but one that I can more or less maintain all the way through the piece, with a couple of very small exceptions. I do arrest the tempo very much in a couple small places, but that's just at the end of phrases, though, here and there, where I think it kind of needs a little breathing room or a little time to kind of set things. Otherwise, I try to keep it more or less steady. So there you go. I hope you enjoy this brilliant, fun sonata. The complete performance, of course, is coming up in just a moment. And otherwise, it just remains for me to thank my generous Patreon supporters and to encourage you to head to patreon.com to support the channel if you like these videos and you want to keep seeing them. And yeah, I'll see you next week for some more music and conversation. Take care. Until then.